Hi everyone, thank you for coming to Art Atrium for this artisan conversation. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay respect to the elders, past, present and emerging. So we have this exhibition today, two solo exhibitions by two artists, Kate Briscoe, who does this beautiful body of work based on Kimberley's. So she goes there a fair bit, and you can see over there's lots of photos of the rock face and the landscape that inspires her. And then in contrast, so while Kate's work is a bit more abstract landscape, we have Oscar Garcia, who has this body of work which is basically more urban landscape or cityscape and suburbia, and they are a lot more representational, but then obviously he introduced various elements of his own sort of thinking with trees and sky and so on. And to have this conversation, we have one of our good friends, Nick Suiters. I remember he actually gave me before a list of what he his bio, and it's so long that you won't have an artist talk after that by the time I finish reading it. So just to be brief, in brief summary, I think Nick was the director, former director of Art Space, and also he was the director of the SCA Galleries at University of Sydney. But now he's an independent curator, just came back from Brisbane. He sort of had an exhibition that he curated over there. So I'd like you to put your hand together for all three of them.
Thanks, Simon. I'm going to say a few words just to create a little bit of a context about the exhibitions, then ask Kate and Oscar to say a few words for a few minutes about their work and their practice, and then we'll start sort of a little bit of a Q&A, a discussion, and then open up to you guys as well, so that we can all join in together and actually think about what it is that we're looking at, and how do we engage these works, and what we think about when we engage these works. And it's interesting because when I was looking at these two exhibitions yesterday, there were so many aspects of entry into them, sort of different thoughts that sort of in the way I was looking and engaging them. But today, we will focus on a few things. So thank you both to Kate and Oscar for making two quite beautiful exhibitions. These exhibitions, as I think is glaringly obvious, are almost polar apart, and they are so different. Not to say they're not engaging, but they're so different in approach to the ideas that not only how they make their work, but what informs their work, and what connects their work, I think, is opposing ideas of how we engage and think about the issue of the landscape. Oscar, I think it's quite obvious, is almost a hyper-realist painter, and he's made these extraordinary hyper-real, I mean some people might say super-real, but yeah, there's a difference, but I'm not sure what that difference is sometimes, I can think about it, but they have a really a strange hyper-real sensation, and he applies colour in a way that sort of like really emphasises the structures and the trees that we're looking at, and that the colours are more brilliant than what we actually see and how we see them. His hyperrealist works examines the impact of the built environment within an urban landscape populated by buildings, towers, cranes, housing, the urban sprawl, and in a way, he represents kind of the developer's dream of how we develop cities. And if there was a bunch of real estate people here, they'd be looking and working out the cost and how they could change it and build better environments, right? And that are much more expensive and will probably fall down in 20 years' time, or be pulled down in 20 years. Sorry, Simon, I know you're an architect. Right.
It probably will last 20 years, for sure.
Well, this is a strange thing about housing now. We've got from buildings that were supposed to last hundreds of years now to buildings that they actually plan their destruction or removal in 20, 30 years.
Yeah.
I find, and so for me, the urban dream is all about time, and that's a little bit what we'll talk about today. But he does so without excluding the living environment of green, the trees, and even the trees are hyperreal as well in the use of colour, which are ever present, suggesting that the trees are a necessary condition of the built environment while setting up a binary of contemporary living in Burwood or Sydney, the Greater Sydney, that for the future of development, the built environment is interdependent and interconnected with the natural environment. That's part of the dream, that that today you have towers that are based on green living plants, and there's one on George Street, I think, which has won a lot of international awards. And that but regardless of that, you can't ignore the developments. Looking at them, we get the feeling of the cost of the built environment, which is founded on the loss of the natural environment. And as I look at them, what the trees remind me of the loss of that landscape, and that landscape now, which is populated by buildings, that they almost have sort of like become present in that landscape. And in a way, sort of like yes, good councils like green policies, but at the same time, development is a priority of cities. But here there is an attempt to create a balance, something that architects, governments, and urban planners are constantly challenged by, balancing the commodified or closed idea of land that's built for occupation, that created these urban conditions, with a much needed free green space that allows us to breathe on the other hand. And so when I look at these things, there's this tension that exists between free space and commodified space, space that has got dollar signs attached to it and has other functions as opposed to the free space. Kate Briscoe's, on the other hand, has uncontained reductive abstractions. And in talking with Kate a bit earlier, that on the surface they look like abstractions, but there's much more in there than meets the eye or the discourse of abstractions. Of landscape focusing on the shifting, eroding geological structures of cliffs, things that have layers, alluvial layers, and layers of knowledge, layers of history, layers of time, are also about change and loss. And when we look at these works, but different concepts of change and loss, particularly when considered in relation to time. Oscar's changes are determined in the human scale and human context of time, as we witness changes that result from development in our time, in our immediate time. We become aware of those changes You know, and when we drive, we suddenly see, you know, realise, hey, there was an interesting building there, and now it's gone. You know, and now there's a tower. And when I'm looking at these, I'm reminded of a story in Beijing where they said to me that one of the reasons why taxi drivers get lost is the speed of change is so intense that a lot of taxi drivers subconsciously and subliminally drive by, you know, recognise marks, you know, buildings and structures, and then they're gone, and then they have to reorient all their thinking because the change is so fast. And so it's what we're looking at is in our time, we have all witnessed Sydney grow, change, develop, and we see free space eroded for development space. But in Kate's work, we see change and loss. Well, the question is, do we see it, or in fact, do we feel it and understand it emotionally and spiritually? When we understand time in its longitudinal context, and this is the sense that I feel with Kate's work, that in contrast to Oscar's work, it's human scale. Here we're witnessing time in longitudinal sense. The history of time becomes very present here. But it also is a change that results over a longer period than our short time relatively. Whilst in whilst in her recordings, she has witnessed the impacts of massive erosion. So there's a quickness of time as well that, you know, that she's witnessed. And these here represent that quickness of time, but within the context of the longitudinal time. And that, you know, thinking about if we look at the map of Australia, you know, it's very dynamic, it's constantly in the process of change, it's shifting, it's changing, it's eroding, etc. The question for me is that in real terms, the geological shifts and changes of our coastlines, the edges of existence, change, erode and shift over a greater length of time than human time, particularly when it's the result of elements. However, understanding these works that record change in relation to our present is the serious question of the impact and pending disaster of global warming. We are witnessing erosion of massive scales in terms not only of our coastlines but internationally, not just as a metaphor of time but as a measure of the speed of deep change in a shorter, more immediate time frames that are close to our own lives and measurement of long time. And I think this is really interesting that what Kate is capturing is that what was once understood in long time, now the time itself is collapsing into immediate time. And, you know, coastlines are eroding, they are falling, they're shifting. Geological time is, our understanding of it is changing. And so it exposes different histories that are recorded in time. And it is here that I believe these two sets of works connect on how we experience the notion of loss in the environment in relation to time. And of course, the techniques that are utilised are vastly different. Reductive abstraction in contrast to heightened realism. But the result seems to suggest the same. Human endeavour is having a major impact on our landscapes and our environment. Everything comes at a cost, a very serious cost, particularly when the finely tuned balance or harmony of our landscapes are altered by human beings. Then there are consequences that remind us now more than ever before that the delicate precondition of that fine balance that is our planet, and we see it every day. And so when looking at these works, I drift into another way of thinking about them. They transport me into other spaces that think about the deeper questions of our own existence and the perilous state of the condition of the planet itself. So without further ado, there's probably a lot of stuff there and hopefully we'll cover some of that. I'll hand it over to Kate, who can now talk a little bit about her work, her process, and her ideas, etc.
Right. Well, a little bit about my growing up. I grew up on the south coast of England, and I went to art school very young. And at the end of that, I taught at school for 2 years, which drove me crazy. I couldn't stand it anymore. And I left travelling to Australia. I met an Australian person, and we came to Australia on a motorbike overland. And there are certain components of the landscapes I travelled through on that journey that sort of made me realise that I really was absolutely fascinated by geology. I'd grown up on that south coast, near Chesil Beach, near the White Cliffs of Dover, all that sort of amazing stuff. But going through landscapes where you had a really incredibly raw, like Pakistan, Afghanistan, you had this really raw landscape where you could see all the structures of the landscape. And when I came here, I wasn't intending to stay, but I did. I got the job I had dreamed of. And I travelled outback, across the Simpson Desert, up across to Fraser Island, all those places where you could see the raw landscape, you could see the structure of the landscape. So that was the important thing to me. Even as a student in Hampshire, I'd never painted the trees and that. And I'm not painting a vista or a panorama, ever. So it was all about what was underneath, what was there, what you could pick up on the beach, those sort of things. And picking up, if you go to Lyme Regis on the south coast of England, you can pick up a rock, and very often you break it and it will have an ammonite in it, a fossil. So that's always been my fascination. So coming here and then being able to work here and go out and look at this landscape. I thought the landscape here was unbelievable, incredible. So it did make me stay. So I wasn't intending to stay, but I kept staying and kept staying. So I've always worked from the landscape here. I've got a very early series of paintings, some of which Simon's seen from the Simpson Desert and the Fraser Island paintings. But this show is from two particular places. One is the Kimberley in the north, which is where the red ones are from, and the black and brown and white zigzags, they're from an island off the coast, of the Kimberley coast, which is an ancient coral reef, which is compressed and has moved into the, in millennia ago, into the top of Australia. So it's been included into that red sandstone of the Kimberley. You have this white lump of limestone. So there's a big contrast in the Kimberley of these colours and textures, which is amazing. So those two zigzags are about this island off the coast, where you can see the layers of coral that have formed and been impacted by sediments and then more coral. So you get a sort of a strata, and then you get breaks in the strata. The red paintings, the red rocks, those are really white rock. They're quite hard. They're not painted on canvas like these paintings. So those red ones are basically Kimberley, and the white ones, the two white ones there, are from Depot Beach. Now Depot Beach is my absolute go-to place because it's close. It's halfway between Bateman's Bay and Ulladulla, and there is a little white sandstone cliff face. It's only small, and you have to walk along this sort of pebbly beach to get to it. But I've been photographing and drawing from that for about 15 years, and it changes on it all the time. But so this painting and the other diptych, the orange and white one, are from that particular little cliff face. But when we went down in March this year, there had been so many really serious weather events that my little thing was almost gone. It was really, really eroded. So the three white ones and the two white smaller ones are from looking very closely at that little rock face and how it's completely changed, and the surface has been eroded and changed, and so that's why I call this show Coastal Erosion, because all these paintings are basically, except for the red ones, are from a coastal erosion. The two ones with the cross are from a beach down there called Wasp Head. There is a photograph on the which comes up on the television of Wasp Head, and you can see this sort of chasm which goes out to the beach, and there are intrusions of fossilised trees in that, so that the black comes from that. And again, it's a sort of white sandstone that's been worn and worn and worn. So, but the story behind it is really about how we must try whatever we can to look after what we've got, because what we've got is terribly important. It's just my way of saying it. My fascination has always been with rocks, so that's my way of expressing it. And I did make a joke at the opening that I'd also been to Catherine Hill Bay up near Port Macquarie, and there you can see the seams of coal. So the little black one at the back, I call it Scotty. So that's basically a sort of explanation of the way I work. I've always worked with this very heavily textured surface. I've always mixed sand with my paint ever since I was a student. The first show I had here when I came to Australia was at Bonython. Now Bonython was a big gallery. It was the big gallery in Sydney. They had 3 separate spaces and a courtyard. And Kim Bonython gave me a show there. And I had this exhibition of works on aluminium, polished aluminium with sand and paint lumps, or sort of not lumps, but and I was scratched I drew into the surface of the aluminium, and that was, I thought, was a beautiful show. But Bonython Gallery then was a bit, you had all these different shows. So the man next to me was from WA. This is a funny story. He was from WA, and his paintings, I couldn't believe that Kim was showing us. These paintings were riders on horseback, with the whips, and it was cowboys. And the guy came in with the cowboy hat and the boots and everything to the opening. And he said, "What the fuck is this stuff?" He said, "What's this? It's rubbish. It's rubbish. This is art. This is art." And it was the most embarrassing opening. And then in the courtyard were these beautiful Joel Ellenberg sculptures, and the Whiteleys were there with Joel Ellenberg. And so we all sort of tried to avoid this guy. And then he came out to the courtyard and he said, "This is all crap too, this is all crap." It was the most bizarre. That was my first show in Australia. Anyway. So.
Thanks, Kate. Kim gave me my first project in Adelaide, and he was Lord Mayor of Adelaide at the time, and it was a big festival of arts production, and he said, "Well, what do you want? And I said, there's this 10-story car park, and I want the entire, which was a city square big, and I said, I want the entire basement. And he just looked at me, and then surprisingly said, yeah, okay, we can do that.
Yeah, he does.
Right.
He was like
And
that,
I found him to be quite an extraordinary, generous person.
He was.
And did Bonython become Gallery A afterwards, or
No,
it
no, they were
wasn't?
totally
They
separate.
were totally
Yeah,
separate
yeah.
places, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Kate. Oscar.
Yeah. So obviously, it's the work I do. It's completely different, I guess. But there's, like you said, I like how you drew comparisons, and I always like hearing how the works are viewed by different, like how they're viewed differently, because I don't intend to paint them with. I like to leave them open. When I attempt to paint, there's always my take on whatever the subject matter is that I'm trying to explore, and but I try to remain neutral. So and I do that objectively. I try to remain neutral because I do think ultimately people will make up their own minds and interpret them differently. But it was great. I always welcome and love hearing how they impact people differently. So a little bit about myself. I was actually the Australian landscape is interesting to me. I've been here most of my life, but I was born in Peru, in South America, and I came here when I was 10. My family decided to bring us over because of all the turmoil that was going on over there, and all those Latin American countries at the time, very unstable. So I grew up here, and it's interesting you say that, the kind of like talking about erosion and how the even the built environment, it's kind of replacing this natural estate, of with the trees and so forth. But one of the first things I remember coming over, because it was a beautiful clear day, landing in Australia, is how green Sydney was. I remember thinking that it's so green. I grew up in Lima, and the coastline of Peru is just desert. It's a desert, and Lima is this horrible city, in my opinion, built on this desert, right? If you find trees, like usually there's trees around, but it's really, and it was so incredible to see so much green in such a major city, really, because and I think you hear about people having been to Los Angeles and Paris, and I've been to Rome, and it's the same thing, like a lot of these cities, you don't see a lot of green. So, it's I don't necessarily. It's probably some subconscious that it's there, that the way that you described how. I don't know why I have this. I just always feel this need to include some form of tree greenery in the paintings because they do tell a story, as well. I think my paintings are very much just the personal explorations into my environment. And for all the time I've been in Australia, I've always lived in the inner west, in that area. So Burwood, Ashfield, that's all I know really. I've ventured out, but this is where I've always lived, and I've gotten to know the place very well. And this is not some kind of, it's not like it's a series of, it's a body of work based on the area. It's just that I drew the inspiration from there, because I do find that with my work, I'm easily inspired. Wherever I've gone, I always think, wow, I can come up with. So, I always say I've got 1,000 ideas in my head from everywhere I've been, and I could, but I don't know why I've chosen a way to paint that doesn't allow me to kind of, explore all the things I want to explore, or I would like to explore in my life. I've almost kind of done the opposite. I've decided to paint in a way that it only allows me to kind of, you know, focus on a few things at once. But yeah, I find the place interesting, and one of the things that that inspired me was that the rate. You talk about the rate because, you know, over 30 years, you know, you see development and it's kind of slow. It seemed slow for me. I was talking to a chap yesterday who asked me a few questions. He's from Brazil and he's only been here a short time. He's saying, what was it like, you know, like what was Sydney like 20 years ago? And I said, oh, it was very different, you know. It was certainly affordable, and you could park on George Street, you know, there was no parking meters, you know, like you could park on George Street. Yeah, there were no trams, you know, we used to go out and park on George Street and just go out all night, you know, and he couldn't understand that. And I said, yeah, no, it was very different, right? So, and I think it's the rate at which it's happening at the moment because, you know, you used to see, I remember when they knocked down Burwood Westfield and it took 2 years to build the new one. This is, you know, 20 years. But now they put up buildings and they go up like that. In 6 months they're up, and then you start to see all the cracks and the horrible things, you know, because they're not very well made. I don't think so. It's interesting that you say, you know, I think that element of how long is it going to last? Because yeah, it's what is the ideal landscape? But we're kind of, in my case anyway, like this is all I know. Really, I'm kind of stuck in that. Not stuck because you can always pick up and leave, right? You can do something about it. You know, you can become an activist and all kinds of things. But I guess this is my way of exploring all of that, and kind of a form of documentation as well, because I do think my work is, I don't impose, it is autobiographical in many ways. I don't impose that onto anyone else, and that's where the neutrality comes in, where I try to kind of keep things open and neutral. But every piece has a personal narrative or narratives, you know, and so yeah, that's what I try to do. And as far as, like, you know, you mentioned the hyper, I don't know. I've always been kind of you know, drawn toward figurative and that kind of, you know, that form of realism, if you like.
Mm-hmm.
And I would love to one day maybe attempt. I don't know. I
have to go somewhere.
Yeah, I'll have to go somewhere because, you know, and I'll be honest. You know, this is I'll be brutally honest. I think so. I've always not struggled with abstract, but it makes it you know, it really kind of demands a lot because it's just, I guess, the way that we view the world. You know, it's so different. But this is what kind of makes most sense to me when I'm trying to paint. When I'm trying to paint, this is what comes naturally, and so I use that because and I enjoy it. I take a long time to paint things, and I never feel rushed. I don't feel the need to rush them in any way, and yeah, I think that's kind of you know, just about. You know, in summary, there's lots of things I can talk about, but in brief, that's essentially the work.
Good, thank you, Oscar. I've got a couple of questions of each of the artists to sort of like kick off a conversation, and I do want it a conversation, so you can interrupt at any point of time. I'm not precious or anything that there's got to be a structure that's rigid. And that because I think all our opinions are important. But Kate, we'll start with you. I think your works are very, very beautiful, but you know, when they filled, what I'm curious is there's a certain intimate examination that you're looking. It's very, very, you know, the scale by which you're looking at something. That's very immediate, very close, very intimate to you. But can you tell us what it is that you see when you look? Because I suspect it's not just looking innocently or graphically. It feels to me like it's a deep looking, an emotional looking of land and rock formations. It is as if you are looking at history and its impact. You're looking much deeper than what it is that you see.
That's very true, Nick. It's when I go to a particular place or I'm looking at stuff, I can see something that the person next to me might not see. It's a quite specific thing, and it might have grown from the way I started as a child, looking at things, making art. I grew up with art. My father was a teacher. I always had materials at home. I had the things on the beach that I was looking at. So everything was very personal in that, looking at these landscapes. So when I go to somewhere like the Kimberley, and I'm in a massive river gorge, which is all red blocks, but it's massive. And then I sort of go, I remember being in a boat going down the Chamberlain Gorge, which is huge, and you're in a boat, an electric boat, it's very quiet, so you're in there in this thing. So I take a lot of photographs, because that's the only way. You can't take lots of gear with you. But then I'll see something, and I make sure I photograph it. I'll see a particular formation that actually rings a bell in my head, and I carry that with me. When I go to Depot Beach, and I look at my little rock face, and it changes, then that is a really, really intimate thing. I feel hurt.
It's traumatic.
It's very traumatic, and as I said, when we went, the actual beach itself had changed. Where there was a big, sandy, lovely beach with grass at the top, there was all of a sudden a lagoon. So the sand, that whole beach had changed in 12 months. And then walking along to my little, what I call my little cliff face, the changes were, it's still beautiful. It's still beautiful. So I'll look at perhaps those little white ones are the little white ones, and the three bigger white ones are the most recent. They're only a few weeks old. And that's from the experience of looking at those. So sometimes I'll look at a 30 centimetre square bit of rock, and I will take that home in my head, and I'll take photographs, and sometimes I do drawings. Sometimes, if I'm very careful, I do rubbings of the rock face. And in my book up there, you'll see a photograph of me probably 12 years ago on my hands and knees rubbing the rock platform at Depot Beach, which is why I went there in the first place, to look at this massive rock platform with the most extraordinary geology. And I got a big piece of Japanese very strong paper, 5 metres long, and I did this rubbing. Like in England, we used to do rubbings of in churches, you know, the gravestones and things in churches. So I made these wax blocks and did these rubbings, which was shown. Nick Vickers showed them at the SA Touring Gallery some time ago, a long time ago. So I've always had this thing about actually dealing with the surface itself. So the surface is terribly important, but then you're making a painting, so you're making an artwork that somehow will explain what you're talking about. So the involvement with the actual painting, the paint and the canvas is another intimacy, and it's very intimate because I now mix my paint in a commercial dough mixer because I use a lot,
Yeah.
and it's very, very heavy. So I've got paint, like acrylic paint, acrylic medium, sand and marble dust, very fine sand. And I make this mixture and in various colours, but mostly at the moment it's all been white, so it's been white. And then I work flat, have to work flat, and I manipulate that as much as I can. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes I'll do a whole canvas and I'm not happy and I can't do anything about it, then it has to go, start again. I once did a very big one, a few years ago for a commission for the West End Hotel in Perth, and it's so big, this canvas, that I had to borrow a friend's workshop. It won't go through a doorway. It's 3 metres by 3 metres, so it won't go through a doorway. So I rented, well, I didn't rent, the guy gave it to me for free, his workshop, just down in St Peters. I had to take my fold-up tables. I had to get Bunnings to cut me a 3 metre plywood board, to put down, and then I had to put my canvas together, my stretcher. I had to carry my buckets of paint. But the funny thing was that because I'm not very tall, so spreading
You could only reach
1.5 metres across, and it the initial spread had to be done all in one day.
Wow.
And so I had my little ladder from the studio to do all that. But the very last minute, I'm just getting it right, the ladder slipped. So flat in the white paint. So it had to be washed off quickly. But that painting, it's a beautiful painting. It's down there in Perth. But that's the biggest one I've done with this particular technique. It's quite difficult actually to work this way because you're looking up from above all the time.
Can you talk a little bit about the two works there? We were talking earlier about the geomorphic.
The strata.
Strata.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, that's that limestone lump that's formed into the top of Australia, the Kimberley. So off the coast, so don't forget that the water especially across the top of Australia, was much lower. So there are islands made of old reef, so they're white basically, but you can see strata in them, and sometimes you can see where they've moved and cracked. So basically they're fault lines and they're strata. So that's limestone, that's sandstone, but they're all white.
And it also informed the colouring, in particular the orange work over there and the ones behind us.
It's these white rocks get stained, and sometimes you find a rock face, particularly down the south coast, where the humidity encourages the lichens to grow, and you get these incredible coloured orange and yellow lichens. But basically this is about the way the erosion from water and from rocks above stains with oxides. It stains the canvas. Obviously it's exaggerated, the colours much stronger than it is, but there are photographs on the screen which none of those have been manipulated. Those photographs are the colour that it is.
But it's interesting in those two in particular. They look to me, they're two canvases that are.
The diptych, they are. They're bolted together.
Diptychs. But what strikes me about them is that you've got the black markings that seem to sort of like drift across both as a narrative, whereas the orange markers, suddenly come to abrupt halt at the edge of the canvas. And so there's almost like two languages at play going on there.
That's because I'm controlling what I'm seeing. So I edit what I see. But then I can manipulate it because I'm making a painting. I'm not just copying what I see. So I'm making a painting. So I might do that. In fact, the staining on a cliff face will generally come from above. So then I've turned it round.
And made it horizontal.
Can I just say, there's a good argument for saying that you're both romantics and you're looking for nostalgia for what was and what's now missing. With that in mind, you were just touching on this about the connection between reality and what you create. Can you talk more about the process of how you actually transfer the reality that you both work with and then make that into what your art is. So it becomes more about the, I suppose, the content rather than the actual techniques.
Look, I think I've always recorded what I see with drawings, rub-ins, photographs, because I was also trained as a photographer before I came here. So I suppose there's one thing I always do is I'm composing what I see, what I'm looking at already. I'm already chopping up that bit of rock to make a sort of composition. So there's always a composition in the back of your head when you're looking at something. So what you're doing, what I'm doing, I suppose, is making the landscape conform to what I like.
Are you specifically reproducing that because you are using photographs, or is that just a stimulus for them?
That's a stimulus. Yes. I'm not copying photographs.
I know that.
I know.
I wasn't.
I am sort of making rocks now because I'm becoming more three-dimensional with the smaller squares, because they are actually like rock. You can pick them up and hold them, you know, they're like
Oscar, you mentioned that there's a certain element of documentation and autobiography in your works, but they could be Burwood, but they could be a number of different suburbs. What is it that you see when you're looking at that constructed environment? What is it that you're trying to, thinking, just sort of going on from David's question, of what is it that you're extracting?
No, that's actually, and it ties in with what David just asked, because I'm always thinking to myself, how do you convey an idea? You know, like if you've got this idea or a feeling, you know, how can you do it? You know, whether it's a painting, whether it's a film, a song, you know, whatever it is, right? Whether it's a building. I think that's the challenge that's what I find the challenge in painting is, this idea of putting what's in your head, you know, or your vision, you know, into this two-dimensional surface, and then if you're incorporating elements of, you know, narratives and whatever, symbols and whatever you're putting in there, are you doing it justice? You know, because sometimes I think I was having this conversation with my wife, Marilyn, the other day, and saying, you know, I often look at my paintings and I think, I don't like them anymore. I want to change them, you know, because did I do them justice? Like, you know, I like the concept, which is kind of like, I think the idea is more important than the painting. And if I'm ever kind of afraid of anything, it's not doing it justice. Like creating an artwork, and it was either, you know, I thought it was a good idea or a good concept to explore, but, you know, trying to render it onto, you know, a painting, because it's a flat surface, you know, you're using paint, so it's I think that's where the challenge, I don't know, it's a form of torture in a way, because, you know, I find sometimes I'm there thinking like it's not really doing or coming together the way that or I'm hoping that it comes out exactly. But, you know, I look at the paintings once they're done, I think they're more or less kind of what I had in mind, you know.
Right.
And the inspiration can be anything, you know. Sometimes the scene just happens to match a thought or an experience or something that just has been lingering in my mind, or I might think, you know what, this will be a good way to kind of, you know, speak about this particular thing or this particular experience. And that's where the inspiration comes from. For me, it's it can be spontaneous sometimes. I do work from photographs, so I often think I have the idea before I actually take the photograph. So I often think, you know what, I've had this idea of this painting, and for instance, the one, I'll talk about individual paintings because it make it easier. The one in the centre there, Transient, which is the one with the Burwood Station. I had wanted to paint that setting for a long time because I like the idea of painting something that captured movement and, you know, change and the idea of just constant change and constant movement. Even though I didn't paint people and so forth, but I had the idea first. I went to the place to take the photo. I took that from a bridge on Shaftesbury Street in Burwood. It just so happens that you had this kind of very interesting linear sunset going on, which seemed really kind of it was rare because I thought it was a wonderful and beautiful coincidence because it didn't last very long, and I also like the fact that with this show anyway, this body of work, the idea of kind of change being constant but the things that we still live in this timeline. We experience things. It's not like, well, it changed. Time is never. It's just this constant thing. So much is going on. Whether it's erosion, our impact on it, the decisions that we make. So not taking it for granted, I guess. And you're talking about mentioning the impact that it has at the local level, at the global level, right? That's very important because I do feel that sometimes we lack that sense of accountability, or vision, long-term vision. These days, I think, when one of the things I admire, I travel through Europe and even having been born in Peru, I grew up right next to a site. It was an archaeological site, right? Not Machu Picchu. It is in Lima, so that's different. But there was this Inca site, and for me it was just like it was right there. I grew up next to it, and so this idea of things that are that were built with long-term vision, whether it's the Colosseum in Italy or all these kind of marvels that we admire, or even if it's just a natural place. But I think we've lost that. I think if there's any criticism in this, not that I intended it to be, but if there is any, I guess it's this idea that that things just get. I think we have a bad habit of like we don't preserve things. I think preservation is a big problem in Sydney anyway. I can't speak for the rest of the country, but I met. I had this lady, this elder lady, come up to me once and said, "Oh, did you know that there used to be this marvelous theatre where Burwood Plaza is? It was a fantastic theatre." I said, "I had no idea. No one has this idea. No one knows, right? It used to be there, and it was fantastic." And they knocked it down like that. They didn't even think twice, right? So they knocked that down. And it's kind of like the thing that happened. You get this feeling today that, and you were saying before earlier to me that. We're so quick to just get rid of it, just replace it. It'll. What's next?
It's all about money.
It's all about the money, and Sydney's a beautiful city. But yeah, and you asked me something earlier, and yeah, like look, there seems to be this, things are happening very quickly, and prosperity has come to, I think, to Australia very fast, and there's obviously the benefits of that, and now we're coming to this point where we're asking ourselves questions, and I think the maturity will show. As a society, I think we'll, because I just mentioned places like Italy, places like Peru. These places have been around for a long time. It's sometimes good to look at what whether it's Japan or China, the cultures and places that have experienced a lot of this. We're kind of just experiencing it ourselves right now. I don't know what's going to happen, but
Maybe the issue is they didn't have real estate agents in those days, right?
It's
And
a unique thing.
If they did, they would have sold those Inca sites.
Surely,
and the Acropolis would have been something else. I don't know.
No, but it's interesting because growing up, Peruvian history, and I don't know if anyone knows much about it, but with the Inca, the Spaniards got there, and the first thing they thought is, let's just get rid of everything, right? But they couldn't, even if they had tried. I think they tried, but they gave up very quickly. So it's very, very, one of the common features that you find in many places, archaeological sites, is that you'll find the foundations, Incan foundations, and then the Incas built on top of that. The Spaniards built on top of that, right? Churches and all kinds of things. And I think the same thing happened in Mexico, so obviously. So you know, they couldn't even knock them down if they wanted to, you know. So, but there's this idea of, like I'm saying, you know, the longevity aspect of it. I think we've lost that, or we're missing it.
When I was saying that nostalgia and romanticism,
Yeah.
I don't see those as negative things.
Mm-hmm.
I see them as you know, very important stimulus for artists, because we are aware of what was as opposed to what is. Hopefully in 20, 40, 50 years' time,
Yeah.
we'll have artists thinking that what we were doing was pretty nostalgic and
Yeah.
pretty wonderful. Who knows? But it's that romanticism, I think, is really important, because as artists we have to believe in more,
Yeah.
something else rather than just what's in front of us. And that's why I
No,
think that's
okay.
You don't mean romanticism as in the movement thereof.
No. Romantic is in pulling from the heart.
Yes, yeah.
I don't know if
It
you've
can be different.
have you seen that movie? I don't want to start going into it, but have you seen that movie Midnight in Paris?
Yeah.
Yeah.
With, you know, and it's an interesting movie because there's this, they're always nostalgic about the past, and then they find a way to actually go into that time. What's the actor? Owen Wilson finds this way to, so he comes across Dali and he comes across all these great artists, right? But then he finds that every time he goes into that era, right, the Belle Epoque, they're nostalgic about the past. And then the further back he goes, in every period, they're always nostalgic about the past. And then he comes to realize, I think, you know, essentially, he's just got to kind of, you know, just immerse himself into his world. You know, I think like we all belong to our time. I think that's the you know. But nostalgia is an interesting thing. I mean, you know, we all know what that is. When we talk about nostalgia, we know what we're talking about. But I don't actually know. I didn't live like in the.
That's why I don't like photography. It's only about nostalgia.
Well, I can't say anything because I'm married to a photographer.
There's a lot of photographers who dispute that, David, but that's another discussion. Kate, we were talking earlier today, and there's an ambiguity in your work, and I've been using the term abstraction, and the ambiguity is that it's somehow both abstraction and real simultaneously. That it's actually real surfaces that you're engaging with, and you're representing them in the narrative of the real, but when you look at them, you can't help but thinking abstraction. And so I was just wondering if you could talk about that little bit of ambiguity that exists there.
Well, I suppose really the thinking and the concept is it's a reductive process. So there's a lot of information there. So I nitpick, I go through all that information that I've got in front of me. When I get back to the studio from this place, and this is an important thing because you've got all these records you've made in various ways. I've got rubbings, I've got photographs, I've got drawings, and I've got the memory. And I then have to sit down and work out how I want to convey this what I've seen. So I mean, there's two meanings of the word abstract. And so there's total abstraction, as of Mondrian, and there's abstracting from. So I'm taking from. I'm editing all the time. So that's my process really. And I actually start some of these big paintings with little tiny drawings in my workbook. So little tiny drawings. And I keep working on them and moving the coloured bits around and just changing them until I've worked out a way of making that painting about that place or part of that place that reads. So it gives the sensation of being there, if you could. I want the person to feel like they're sitting in front of some rock or landscape or component of landscape. So you get this sort of sensation that I'm trying to give.
I think that's a really important distinction in what we're looking at, because it's the appearance of abstraction, but in reality, you know, it's actually possibly more real than real, because what you're rather than abstracting something out, maybe it's extracting something out,
Yes,
something
that's right.
something that's there, but when you look at it, and particularly, you know, we're in an art gallery, and you can't help but use the term abstraction, which they kind of are, but then when you shift the ground to extraction, and you're actually looking at it and sort of saying, well, you know, we're looking at something that's possibly more real than the abstract art terminology, etc. But Oscar, like,
if I can just add something just quickly, because you know, not long ago we went to we took a trip to Newcastle and we went to Caves Beach. I don't know if that beach over there, and it's funny, you know, we were there walking and I think we were saying to each other, these look like Kate's paint. No, but it's interesting how you actually start to think, and I remember finding myself going into one of those little kind of tunnels, and when you're up close, I think that's what you're referring to, when you're up close, you start to realize, my gosh, like your works, Kate, are actually a lot more real than you know, that one would think at first glance. And I've been fortunate enough to be to your studio as well and see the process and see all the materials there, and it's fascinating. But yeah, it's interesting how you can think of them as abstract, but when you're standing in front of a rock formation of, you know, cliff or something, suddenly you think, oh my gosh, like they look.
Well, it is an abstract
replicas
form,
of that,
it's
you know.
a thing.
Yeah.
It's a thing, but it's
really interesting.
yeah.
And the colours as well, you know. It's really So your work's almost it's real. It's a
They're real
extreme
rocks.
form. Yeah, they're real rocks. You know, it's a way to look at it. Yeah.
Oscar, when we were talking a bit earlier, I sort of swung the discussion to social justice issues and the politics, because everywhere you look there, you know, from a close-up of the apartments to the distant shot of the apartments to houses, etc. You can't help notice, you know, the idea of house, but in today, the big debate is on the affordability of housing and the lack of public housing, and how a new generation is now being they've been kind of taken out of the market of housing. So in a way, you know, your work sort of like raises those concerns indirectly, because they're solid structures which people own, and yet we're moving towards a generation of that everything is becoming more temporal, everything is becoming out of reach. Do you care to comment on that?
Well, it's interesting, you know, because I don't deliberately try to make my paintings political, but at the same time, and this is probably like, so my father was a hard line, you know, leftist. He would have called himself a communist. You know, he was. I grew up with that
guy.
You know, right? So I grew up hearing about, you know, all these socialists. You know, I think it was very popular at the time in Latin America anyway. And he went to university. He ended up being in the Air Force, but he did go to university. And you know, and he went to a very left-wing, you know, university. So we grew up with that kind of, you know, he would say everything is politics. You know, it doesn't matter what it is. Like every aspect of life is politics. Right? Politics is in everything. So I grew up with that in the back of my mind. So I guess, you know, it must have some impact on, even if it's just on the subconscious level. But yeah, you can definitely look at something like the affordability crisis that we're experiencing, and also the idea of ownership. You know, like what like, you know, you know, who can really afford a lot of these, you know, all these places, and you know, I've seen Burwood, or where I've lived, I've seen it. It was very affordable at one point, and now it's just ridiculous, you know. And especially when you talk about younger generations. Honestly, I don't know. I mean, I've got 2 young kids. I don't know how they're gonna, you know, how they're gonna kind of do it, really.
Well, Simon's going to sell all of it, and then you're going to invest it, and it's going to...
But then you just add to the problem, you know what I mean? So it's like, it's this intergenerational issue at the moment that we're having, but look, you can definitely, you know, you can take that from the work, and I guess, you know, I don't mind touching on political, you know, issues. But certainly, it's not like I intended to do. I do. Once again, I do try to paint in a way that that the works, the paintings can open up discussions, and like an onion, you know, there's layers. You can go into whatever you want, you know, and like there's always my take on it, you know, which I'm happy to share, you know, but yeah, if they raise political questions, that's great. You know, the more you dig, the more you can kind of, you know, open those conversations, and I'm definitely, I definitely welcome that. Yeah.
You know, we've been talking about different attitudes to the idea of landscape, and I'm really conscious that, you know, we're all on, regardless of which perspective that you're looking at, we're all on Aboriginal land, and Aboriginal land that always was, and I accept the slogan always will be, and I'm going to deviate away because I don't think you could just have an art conversation without looking at contemporary issues, right? Because art is not neutral, art is not innocent, art itself is inclusive, and you know, today we're moving, you know, the Prime Minister announced a referendum date for yes or no on sort of like how we deal with this issue of inclusion and constitutionality, and I was just wondering what, it's to both of you, what you, as artists, I think artists are important people in the debate, because I've always thought that, and you know, just what David said as well, artists see the world differently, artists think about the world differently, and it's not necessarily in the you know, sort of cut, dried, neat, packaged way that we're presented with. And I was just wondering what you both thought about the issue of the referendum and of Indigenous rights.
Well, I mean, obviously you've got to vote yes, haven't you? You know, I think there's a lot of obfuscation, disinformation and rubbish. So you know, and don't forget that it was the art world, it's artists who in the 70s started to buy Aboriginal artworks. So the Aboriginal art movement, which is now extraordinarily valuable financially, was really encouraged by people like me, like Ron Robertson Swan. We were all buying, collecting Aboriginal artworks when people thought they were all painted by monkeys. You know, it was a magical moment, and now it's a very, very important component of the art world. So I could not understand any artist voting no. I just wouldn't understand why they could do that, because, and if you've travelled outback a lot, like I have, especially in the 70s, and meeting those communities and seeing how they live, or all the difficulties. Up in the Kimberley, when I first started going to the Kimberley, I remember meeting this young woman on the, I think we were at El Cuestra. Anyway, she'd just flown in. She'd been flown in a small plane. She was the local dentist. She was a travelling dentist, this young woman. And I said, because my sister used to be a dentist, I was asking her what sort of treatment she had to do. She said, you couldn't imagine how bad the teeth are because I'm doing root fillings on 12-year-olds. It's just dreadful. And she said, you know what a Kimberley breakfast is? A meat pie and a Coke. That's it. So it sort of makes you think, well, you know, this is really difficult stuff. It's really difficult.
Yeah.
So whatever can, and all the money that's been thrown around, you know, in a lot of these communities, and they're still living in terrible conditions because nobody administers it properly. You know, we've seen that especially with Conservative governments in every component of our lives, how mismanaged they've been. Look at the Snowy 2 project, billions, and that's not going to work. They didn't do their geophys properly. So there's all that sort of stuff. So I think we've just got to get in there and listen to the First Peoples and what they want in their different communities and how it can possibly be managed, because it's all very different. A community in the Kimberley will be totally different to one in Kakadu. You know, and there's so many different groups. So it's very complex. So we need the information to come and be looked at so that it can be administered properly and no more money wasted. It needs to be spent properly. So that's my take.
What about you, Oscar?
I think it's very interesting. Like, it's so I can't help drawing the comparison to my. It seems to me that a lot of what's happening today. How do I explain it? So, drawing comparisons to my heritage upbringing, you know, we have that indigenous component already, and although the Spaniards came in and caused, you know, all kinds of brutalities, and you know, there's that, you know, the Americas, Peru, you know, Mexico, because we have someone from Mexico. You know, I was talking to him earlier, and you know, they're a lot longer. I guess the history is a bit. You know, there was a lot more time for reconciliation and that kind of thing. I mean, there's a lot of horrible things that are still going. But growing up, it was interesting because we never I guess fusion happened. You know, over such a long period of time that. You know, if I was to do my DNA test, I'm sure I've got Spanish and, you know, and I've got native in me, and I've got all kinds of things, and it's something. It's interesting because growing up, that was part of our identity. We kind of, and I think that's one of the missing components is that there seems to be, for me, because I've always also thought it's interesting. You know, I came here when I was 10. I grew up, and I didn't know much about, you know, Aboriginal culture, and we didn't learn much about it at school. But I could name you all the Incas that you know, that I've forgotten them now, but I could name you all these kind of you know, the emperors of the time. So, you know, I think there's a lack of education. It does seem to be happening very abruptly. I think, you know, all these issues are coming together, and I think that's what is causing a bit of, if there is division, you know, it's this idea that I think it's all happening very quickly. I certainly in my work I don't I mean, I'm always conscious of that, but it doesn't it by no means it's kind of, you know, touching on that subject, but it's certainly important. I think I haven't been to those communities, you know. I can only speak for what happens in my environment. I think it's not. I think it's very sad that, you know, you sometimes hear that there was, for instance, in my community, there's no remnants of anything. There's no you know, the Wangal people is completely gone. You know, there's nothing there to remind us. And I think this is an attempt, as I say, you know, to close the bridge, to close the gap, you know, to bring everything together. But I do like on a fundamental level, I do believe that things best happen when they happen, you know, organically and naturally rather than forced. I think it's an attempt, you know, like this referendum, it's an attempt to bring people together. Whether it works or not, though, like we'll see, you know, because I mean, I think most people will vote yes. That's what what you think, but whether then that goes on to solve the issues that you're talking about.
Well, it's a start.
Yeah, it's certainly a start. I'm of the idea you're always better to do something than not, hopefully things. But to be honest, I think it's gonna take a long time to fix. I don't think it'll be I don't think it's gonna fix anything in the immediate term, and I think that the issues are far more deeper, and there needs to be a lot of. I think things need to change on lots of different levels, and I'm a big, I guess you talk about artists, in their view, if, artists can art can educate, and I think education's key, I think educating, to me, education plays it's even more important than say, for me it's even more important than a vote. I mean, you heard growing up, I've heard this so many times, you're so much better investing in education in, let's say, third world countries and so forth, especially in women and that kind of thing, because that will inevitably, that's a lot better than other forms. But yeah, I think it's interesting to see what's going to happen. I hope that everything works. I've always felt a bit of an outsider in the sense that coming to Australia from a different country as an immigrant, I consider myself an immigrant.
So am I.
Yeah, and the discussion just seems to be kind of. I feel like we're only getting involved into the discussion, so the exposure is good, and I think the discussion is good to have. But the idea of what's happening in Indigenous communities, we need to also have that shown as well, because people don't see it. I think
and we also have to point out that it's some Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
We can't just label them all as being problematic. There are some communities which are absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
And I think that should be recognised as well. I don't think that it's all an issue.
Oh, but I guess I was referring more to the injustice aspect of it, or if having a voice,
I think there's a lot more. I mean, I think the voice is good in terms of raising it to the forefront, maybe of our consciousness, our frontal lobe. But there's a lot of assumptions that people have to make because they don't have the information that others do. And I mean, that goes with Indigenous culture regardless. They have so much information that we don't have. I mean, the most simple assumption is that they're one community or they're one people, and they're not. There are over 500, maybe 550 different dialects. And when I speak to people about it, because I work with Aboriginal people and young people mostly from fractured homes and other things, and I did travel in my 20s around Australia. I liken it to Europe, and I say, so, you've got France, Germany, and the Netherlands and England. Do you think they're all going to agree?
no.
Well, what's the difference here?
Yeah.
You've got 500 different municipalities, countries, whatever you like to call them. Of course they're not going to agree, but they have some core issues. And the statistics are that the health is less. I mean, there are different communities that have different issues, but it's even the way families operate clash with Western culture and how we operate in the nuclear family. There's so much that the average Australian does not understand, and really you really have to want to know more to understand how you can help.
Yeah.
And I've been in situations with Closing the Gap, Came Out, other things, and communities just in Sydney can't agree. And someone will talk about 200, 300 years ago. No, you hurt my brother. Back in the day. I've done recruitment panels for Aboriginal communities and other things, and all that sort of cultural aspects of working with people is just misunderstood. It's just one one group of people.
That's what I kind of
It's
like.
not.
It's a lot more complex than because they're making it like comparing it to Europe. I think ultimately humans are humans. You know, like the problems are going to be the same everywhere you go. Whether he fixes it or not, I'm you know that's kind of like. But certainly it's. I mean, you know, once again, if when looking at the work that I do, I'm speaking about my own work here. It's not something that I was personally, exploring. But there's always that opens it up. Like I said, the paintings, the artwork can always open up to the idea of land and ownership and building on land that wasn't yours, or I'm not personally building anything, a house, or because but it's interesting though. Like for me, the idea of ownership, I guess, it's an interesting idea. The concept of owning something has always kind of been interesting to me, because then it gets passed on from one person to another. This is not in relation to Aboriginal communities, just in general. One of the things that I've always found interesting is, how do you own something? Like, whether it's an idea or a thing, and then it doesn't exist anymore, and so yeah. But certainly, it's we'll see. We can only see what happens.
Okay. Would anyone like to ask the artists any questions in relation to what they see and the works that surround us? Well, I think it's a small enough group that we can sort of finish now, and we can actually sort of like intermingle. And thank you to Simon for making this happen.
Thanks very much for the discussion. I think it's really interesting.
Thank you, Nicholas. Yeah.
And it also, like, just on the note of the Yes campaign, I'm actually a very passionate supporter and advocate for the Yes campaign. I've organized 3 panel discussions already on it. I was involved with Rachel Perkins on the promotional video on the Yes campaign. So I like to think that we will all vote yes, but obviously it's all up to everybody. But I just really don't understand how anyone can campaign for the no campaign on the basis of, if you don't know, vote no. I mean, how can anyone go through life like that? If you don't know, you find out about it. So you can't just say no just because you don't know about it. So I always say to people that you should listen to your heart and then find out about the facts. There's too much misinformation out there. So you've got to find out about the facts and then you vote with your heart. So yeah, I mean, I would hate to wake up on the 15th of October and find that we are saying no to the Aboriginal people. They are the most disadvantaged people among all of us, any of us, and they deserve to at least have a voice to give feedback and comments on any policies that the government will impose on them. So, but I'd like you all to put your hand together for our 3 speakers.